Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session. We have a great guest today, and I don't want to preempt and steal the thunder, but Anthony Foxx, he used to be head of transportation in this country. He's a former Secretary of Transportation, and he recently moved to the dark side, and now he is in charge of government relations. And dealing with all sorts of political issues at Lyft. And I'm not supposed to ask any questions about Lyft because, as you know, guys, they're on the street, they're fundraising, and they're doing roadshow. And so, but I have plenty of questions for Anthony. And he's a great speaker, and I'm sure we'll enjoy the conversation today. And so maybe you can start with a quick introduction about your life and how did you end up as a mayor of Charlotte, and then became U.S. Secretary of Transportation, and now you're with Lyft.
Yeah, at least in the first two cases, my wife is often asking me the same thing. How in the world I go into politics, but I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, where actually Steph Curry is my homeboy, and we're also fellow Davidson graduates. But I nevertheless grew up in Charlotte at a very tumultuous time when it was dealing with school desegregation and so forth. And I had leaders in my community who really stood up and made my life so much better than the generation before. In terms of making that work. So when I graduated from college and law school and started thinking about what I wanted to do with my life and my time and my energy and whatever talents I had, I sort of gravitated to the public sector because I found that it was a place where I could make an impact almost immediately and see the fruits of that impact bear out in the real world. So I started in local government. I was elected in 2005 to the city council, served 2 terms. In 2009, narrowly elected as the youngest mayor in the city's history in 2009. And right in the recession, we used our recession situation. We're the second largest banking center in the country. So we were abnormally hit hard by the recession. And transportation became kind of a Keynesian way for us to both employ people and also build for the future. So that attracted the notice of President Obama and, beam me up, Scotty, and the rest kind of happened. So.
Yeah, it sounds terrific. And I know at some point you decided to join Lyft. And why Lyft? What attracted you in this company and transportation network companies in general?
Yeah, sort of 4 things. My municipal experience really got me really super interested in the future of cities. After sitting through zoning meetings for 8 years, I also started to really connect the dots with transportation and land use and the fact that you really can't solve one of those problems without solving the other. So they're very closely connected. So policy became also a passion of mine. And then as secretary, came into my position without either the White House or the Congress asking a single question about things like drones, autonomous vehicles, anything like that. And yet, as I started to do my first tour around the country and really see what was going on, it was clear to me that a lot of these emerging technologies were going to be central to the future. So I cast myself and actually worked really hard to put some tent poles in place for those technologies that allowed them to come into bear for regulatory purposes. So it was kind of a combination of cities, policy, technology were the intersection of things I was looking for, and Lyft kind of sits right in the middle of those things.
And so you are now Chief Policy Officer at Lyft. And any hints, any insights, any guidance on how entrepreneurs should work with the governments, at what time they should engage, should they ignore the governments for a while, and then hope no one will go after them, and so any hints, and probably from both sides of
Yeah.
Both perspectives.
So I think entrepreneurs who are in the Internet of Things space have a different burden than the entrepreneurs who sort of came through what I'd call the first wave of the internet revolution, where everything was kind of in cyberspace, and you couldn't hit a pedestrian in cyberspace. You couldn't, like, there were things that just you weren't going to do. With the Internet of Things, you're more or less colliding with existing regulatory issues, and there's not a real space carved out, and government really doesn't quite know how to deal with it. So in my mind, I think entrepreneurs who are within particular sectors, even if they're competing day by day on the street for business and market share, have a vested interest in thinking together about how to hand government the tools to work with them. Because it'll take government like 5 to 6 to 100 times longer to figure that out than you can help government figure it out. I'll give you an example. I'm in Germany touring a BMW plant, standing next to the CEO of BMW, and he's explaining to me how the federal motor vehicle safety standards require that a brake pedal actually be in a car that a human foot can touch, and how that regulation was making it difficult for their auto park function to actually work and get approved under U.S. government regulation. And so there are all these things that you're going to run into if you're not careful, and there's no point in an individual company that's a startup trying to figure this out and approach government alone. I think you need to build coalitions among like-minded companies to take the issues on that you see as the biggest ones.
How about different levels of the government? And so think about city, think about state, think about federal governments. Do you see them acting differently? Are they responding to different stimuli differently? Where should I start as an entrepreneur?
So I think it's fairly easy to say generically that as you go higher on the tent pole of government, it gets incredibly more difficult to access as an entrepreneur. So in other words, if you're dealing with local government, it's a little more accessible than dealing with the federal government. That said, there's terrain that governments are intersecting over. So, for example, the autonomous vehicle, today, as an operator of a vehicle, you get to spend the better part of a day at DMV going to get your driver's license and prove to DMV that you can drive. For an autonomous vehicle, there's a major question as to whether the prerogative of the states over operations should still control. An industry in general has expressed concerns that you could end up having 50 different standards. So there's what we interpreted in the U.S. government was that the federal motor vehicle safety standards, which heretofore has basically governed the physical vehicle, also gave us the authority to regulate the software and the operations, which could create one standard that could apply all over the place. I say that because what you're going to find is that depending on what your business is, different levels of government are going to have different prerogatives regarding what you do. And as a result of that, it may govern which one you have to deal with versus which one you might want to deal with. That makes sense?
Yeah, thank you. And I understand why federal government tries to regulate autonomy across the country. But what's happening with, say, Lyfts and Ubers and transportation network companies? What is happening with scooters? What is happening with all the micro-mobility developments?
Yeah, I mean,
who's in charge, or who should be in charge?
Yeah, it's. I mean, a lot of the regulatory terrain around city streets belong to the cities, and so you can easily see how one city may take an approach towards some of the microtransit that's different than another city would take, and that's just kind of in the category of it is what it is. So every place you have to deal with the local prerogatives differently. I think when you start talking about automobiles, or let's say aviation with drones, whole different ballpark, because the FAA is going to have a lot to say about drones at the federal level, and I think there will be a lot of hands in the pot on the vehicle.
Okay. And again, I started the company. We just had Mark Lawrence here telling how he penetrated Chicago, and he used as a land and
hero.
expand, spot hero, how he penetrated Chicago and how he started using it as a leverage to enter new markets. And so if I want to be successful in one city, or I want to target 3 cities, that's all I have my money for. Which cities to target? Who will be the trendsetter? Which one is the easiest to interact? And then you can say, hey, I'm in this and that tier 1 city, and therefore I'm legitimate.
Yeah. You look, Chicago's an interesting case because it's obviously third largest city in the country, and it's like major market. What you'll find about a lot of the tier 1 cities is that they tend to be home rule cities as well, meaning that those cities have a larger amount of say over many, many aspects of life in that city than some cities that are not home rule. Charlotte, for example, was not home rule. So in Chicago, the mayor is, I don't know, king is not the right word, but the mayor has a lot of sway in Chicago. Ron would probably say he's king, but anyway. But yeah, so, in those cities, it's both harder and easier to do business because you know who the decision maker is, but it's also difficult because you have lots of people trying to influence that decision maker. And what I think at the local level is so critical is really expansive use of your network, because a lot of what you're trying to do is cut through a lot of the red tape that you'd go through in the front door just to create the entry point to be able to explain whatever your idea is or to work through whatever the permitting system might be. So, knowing the person who, knows the mayor or knows the mayor's chief of staff or what have you, I would certainly encourage creative use of your full network at the local level. I would also say this, though, just looking at demographics, I think some of what people are missing is the opportunities in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, many of which are not home rule, but many of which, as a result, aren't run by politicians, but are run by professional city managers who are looking more at cost-benefit analysis and probably taking a more rationalized approach to making decisions. And those cities are fast growing. The Southeast is going to explode over the next 30 years. Obviously, out here west, you're seeing a lot of growth. And so I think the wave of the future will be in some of those places as well.
Okay. Thank you. Question on just interactions with startups and overall excitement or lack of excitement about innovation.
Yeah.
And so at some point, San Francisco was very excited about trying everything new.
Yeah.
And now they're overwhelmed, I think, a little bit with a lot of new initiatives and new products and new services on the market. And we see startups going to Seattle and trying to convince Seattle to be the test ground. And so what's happening in general, kind of startup, government, startup, balance of power or level of excitement?
Yeah, it's interesting to see. I'm actually excited to see a lot of the activity happening in other cities. And in fact, you may recall that when I was secretary, one of the things we did was the Smart City Challenge, where we actually put federal money behind an innovative approach to letting cities start to unlock how technology can solve things like congestion, sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think cities are kind of primed to try new things. I think a lot of elected officials will really want to try new things. Here's the problem that you run into is that the real radically smart improvements in government are going to require almost a rewiring of government. And so what ends up happening is, despite the lofty ambitions, the changes that you guys are trying to access end up happening more incrementally, because the literally the budget system. Just if you came to me with like a budget system, you say, hey man, I got a major thing that you can put it on your app and you can like move numbers or whatever. I go to my budget director, and this is literally true. I go to my budget director when I'm mayor of Charlotte, and they're using the budget system that was put in place in 1971, the year I was born. So, if you really, so what I'm saying to you is that take your big ideas, but like promote them in a more bite-sized manner, because, the governments, particularly local governments, sometimes struggle with being able to actually absorb the biggest of the ideas you might have.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Super helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, just
be
hey man, I
patient.
got this big thing, we can do it, blah, blah, blah. And then the mayor's like, great, I love it, blah, blah. And then he sends it to his chief of staff, and by the time it comes down to the budget director and to the procurement person, they're like, hey, do you have some pencils you can sell us? It's just like, it's a different thing. So that's what I mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw we have about 5 minutes, and so maybe the last kind of question or request for me, any advice for people in the room, and maybe we should have time for one or two questions.
Yeah, the only other thing I would say is that, if you can get something done in Chicago, get it done. If you get something done in LA, get it done. New York, get it done. But let me tell you, like, if you can get something done in Poughkeepsie, get it done. Like, I wouldn't over obsess about the size of the city that you're accessing. If you're trying to access a city, I would really worry more about trying to get a good test bed for what you want to do and building proof points, because a proof point in Poughkeepsie is more valuable to you than an attempt in Chicago that can't scale for whatever reason. So I just think it's really important to get successful somewhere and then use that as a jumping pad to go elsewhere.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah.
From the audience?
Still have 5 minutes of talk.
Oh, I still have 5 minutes of talk.
Okay.
Oh. But maybe Maurice.
Well,
Yeah.
You said something about, at the beginning, about organizing startups in the mobility space to concentrate efforts on governments.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any really successful examples that we can follow? Or anybody who's doing that well now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in aviation, I've been surprised to the good at how drone manufacturers and operators have really mobilized to push FAA towards adopting rules that are helpful to the industry. And there are people, the DJLs, there are all kinds of companies out there that are competing daily against each other, but they all have an interest in creating the operating space for their products to exist. And that's kind of the thing that I would say, particularly at the federal level, where many of these technologies do have to get some form of approval to exist, that you can't go as one-offs, and you can't go as self-interested, give me the rules that help my business more than someone else's, because what you're going to get is a jaundiced look from government. And you also, in some sectors, have to also recognize that there's some incumbency by other players that is longer in time and probably deeper in relationships than some of the ones that you'd be bringing to the table. So there's strength in numbers, to borrow a phrase from the Golden State Warriors.
Okay.
In terms of the kind of micromobility side of things, how much first mover advantage do you think there is in, you said that it's better just to have a proof case and rather than going after a big market, but people, it seems, are sort of rushing to be the first in places. Do you think there's any advantage to doing that kind of thing? I
think it depends on the particular product you're talking about. It's hard for me to answer that question without people reading into it more of a commentary on some of the businesses Lyft has, which I can't really talk about in our quiet period. But so I have to give you more of a generic answer. But I think that I think cities are looking for partners. They're looking for organizations in the private sector who are really truly trying to help solve the problems that they have. And I think there's sometimes a fine line between being a problem creator and a problem solver. And and I think that's increasingly where cities are looking to be able to trust a business to work with them well. So that's the best I can do with the question at this point.
You mentioned before Poughkeepsie is maybe a good proof case.
Or Peoria.
Yeah.
Or
Do you
yeah.
think there are certain cities that are best to kind of drive political change to start in certain jurisdictions? And what are the characteristics that you look for in terms of a city or a jurisdiction to kind of know that it would be a Poughkeepsie versus something else?
Yeah, I would, first of all, I think the first division I would make is between a home rule city and a non-home rule city. And then I would make a division between, what the mayor in that home rule city is interested in. I'll give you an example. I was just on a panel at Harvard with the new mayor of Minneapolis, who has passed this amazingly progressive housing ordinance and zoning ordinance in Minneapolis. And he's 37 years old. He's looking to try new cool things. And would be an awesome partner if he got engaged in something he believed in. On the other hand, as I said before, you have cities that are more city manager style, that are run more by professional managers, and some of them are starting to build a reputation as being relatively innovative. Austin, for example, is a city that's structured that way. And so yeah, you'd want to have touches with the mayor and the local elected officials, but you'd also, I think, have a better than decent chance of being able to lay a concept out there and have it actually looked at in a fairly rational way as well. So that's how I would start thinking about where I'd work.
I have the last question then.
All right.
Or I don't know how we're doing on time. So how do you envision transportation ecosystem? Let's say 10, 20, and 30 years from now.
Yeah. I think we're going to, first of all, I think people are finally catching on in America that the car is really not our friend. It helps us get places. It's sometimes cool when it goes fast. But in terms of an organizing principle for cities, it's really not what we really want to build our cities around. We want to build our cities around us. And I think that's going to be increasing, particularly given that the two largest demographics we have in the country right now are baby boomers and millennials. Those of us Gen Xers are going to get mowed over completely by those generations. And what they're looking for is a more livable lifestyle. They want to be able to walk out of the door and be able to go to the grocery store, to the dry cleaners, or what have you. They don't want to be sitting in traffic for a long time. And if they do, they want to be doing something else. So I think we're looking at an age where people are rationalizing their decisions about how they invest in transportation. They may look at the $8,000 to $9,000 a year we're spending owning vehicles, and the fact that those vehicles are 95% idle, and they may start saying, you know what, I'd rather spend my money on trips than on owning a car. But the supply of transportation alternatives has to be there for them to be able to make that choice and feel good about it. So that's going to be, transit. I don't think transit's going away, and I don't think it should go away. I think transit is a critical part of the ecosystem. I think these alternatives, such as the ones that wonderful companies like Lyft provide, are important parts of it. I also think walking, sort of the old-fashioned way of getting around is also coming back in style. So I think cities are increasingly going to be, taking down some of these interior freeways, creating green space, affordable housing, a more livable kind of superstructure around us, and we'll be spending more time just as people enjoying each other's conversation, just like I did today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei.
Thank you, Anthony. It was a great
Thank you.
conversation. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.